So Chattergate was the location for political speeches and rallies. And it was here that Cleo was photographed attending communist rallies, which got the FBI interested in her and Phil. But they seem to have recognized that she wasn't a serious member. She was just sort of interested in the scene, and they actually tried to get Phil and her to work for the FBI to go to Mexico City and report on communists there. And it was only because one of Cleo's professors told her that was immoral that they decided not to do it.
Ah, the good old days.
Ah, the good old days. Yeah, it's hard to understand Phil's sort of later passions about communism without understanding the roots of it here, which were, pretty radical and definitely dangerous and part of, the McCarthy era.
Right,
And,
exactly.
Really, he's really a page out of that whole chapter in history. He was on campus in 1949 or 50, I think, as a student for one semester, and didn't do well with the big crowds and big classrooms and agoraphobia. Right.
So he left after one semester because of that?
Yeah, I don't think he even finished the semester. I think it shows that he withdrew from his classes. So I think Phil was playing on campus when he was a kid. This would have been between moving here from Colorado at 2 or 3, and then leaving for Washington, D.C. And probably by the time he came back from Washington, D.C., he was 7 or 8. Wasn't long before they shipped him off to Ojai for boarding school. So it would have been sort of catch as catch can, but you see these beautiful places where he would have played as a kid. This is, or was, University Radio, located on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, near the town center. In terms of lore, this is where Phil Dick lost his virginity to a young woman named Jeanette Martin at the arranging of his co-worker and friend Vince Lusby.
In the basement?
In the basement, they had a listening room. Exactly, they had a listening and viewing room where people could check out the new TVs that had a nice couch down there. And that's where Phil and Jeanette did the deed. And my dream is to convert this into a Philip K. Dick museum. You can see it's available. What the rent is involved, I don't know, but we're really close to the town center of Berkeley. All kinds of great stuff. Yeah, it's perfect. Dick would have worked here from probably the mid 40s to 55 or so when he quit to write full time. All right, this is Tupper and Reed, the last music store that Phil worked in. Tupper and Reed were an old homosexual couple who everybody in Berkeley knew that they were romantically involved, and they, didn't care. And Phil was asked to manage this record store after leaving Herb Hollis's operation at Art Music. And his problem here was that he didn't like being upstairs. The showroom was rather claustrophobic, and he just couldn't handle it. And so it was this last job that he had here before giving up to write full-time and eventually to move to Point Reyes.
Oh, that's
One of
good, yeah.
Phil's anxieties seemed to be being in places that he couldn't get out of easily. And so the fact that there was a single entrance upstairs seemed to have really bothered him, really played on his anxieties. Berkeley, the city, is naturally named after a person whose name was George Berkeley.
Right.
And he was a philosopher who, like Phil Dick, had a lot of skepticism about the nature of reality and the amount of reality that we make up in our minds. And so the story goes that these rich, white, powerful people were standing on this hillside looking out at this strand of pines, and they were trying to think about what to call this area because they were going to build a giant public university here. And somebody quoted this line from one of George Berkeley's poems. It's like, westward the course of empire winds, something like that. And they go, oh, wow, that's great. Let's call it Berkeley. And so you get the weird assonance here is that the guy's name was Berkeley with an Irish accent, I guess. and yet we are here in Berkeley. Now, if you turn your camera over here, you're going to see this is Berkeley High. This is a new building, but I think the location is the same. This is where both Philip K. Dick and Ursula Gwynn attended high school.
So they were peers, classmates?
Classmates, but Ursula was skipped ahead a year, and Phil did his final year at home study because his anxieties were so extreme.
And apparently they never really knew each other.
Not only did they not know each other, but Ursula claims that she's never found anybody that she knew in high school that knew who Philip K. Dick was. Philip K. Dick, class of 1946, was an American sci-fi novelist who wrote 44 published novels such as A Scanner Darkly, that's correct, Blade Runner, that's incorrect, and The Adjustment Bureau, which is also incorrect. 10 of his novels have been adapted to major motion films as well as Marvel Comics and theater adaptations.
Marvel Comics.
Yeah, that's the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep graphic novel.
There's Electric Ant too.
Oh,
Electric Ant is
yeah.
Marvel.
That's right. That's right. And then here's Ursula. You can't even read what she did. They admired each other's work, and he was telling her about various aspects of his life and his mystical experiences, and she was telling him to write better women. And he listened. And after he wrote Transmigration of Timothy Archer, he wrote a triumphant letter to Ursula saying, "I've done it." So she was definitely an influence on his changing his attitudes and writing about women, for sure. This is 1711 Alston Way, where Phil lived with his mother from 1944 to 47 or 48. The story is that Phil and his mother had separate bedrooms here. And
Well, that's good.
yes, and that they would each retire to their chambers, essentially, and they would oftentimes talk to one another from their own bedroom. Phil referred to his mother as Dorothy. She called him Philip. They had a kind of adult relationship that was sort of emotionally unfulfilling for Phil, I think.
She wasn't the warmest person.
She wasn't the warmest person in the world, it seems, and but very adult, very smart, and very put a lot of emphasis and value on reading and learning. She wrote a bunch of stuff. She wrote some channeled work where she received the work from some great beyond that she merely transcribed. There is a way to read Philip K. Dick as in his teenage years really organizing his life around resisting his mother and being different from her and being a materialist and a skeptic and an atheist.
In other words, he was a teenager.
Well, yeah, and at the time, his mother was bringing Scientologists over to his house with Cleo, and they were speaking in tongues and that kind of stuff. And Phil was incredulous; he couldn't believe it. Well, what we're going to see is that for him, he makes a big deal about moving out. In fact, in a couple of novels, when he's talking autobiographically in his internal monologue, he's saying, "I worked so hard to break free from my mother." What we're going to see is breaking free from his mother involved moving about 3 blocks this way, and then they'd see each other every day and every night. They still continued to hang out. So this is McKinley Street. So right around the corner up here, he would have moved in with Robert Duncan and Jack Spicer, and there may have been another guy. It was sort of just a rooming house for Bohemian Cal students, and both Duncan and Spicer went on both to be sort of celebrated poets. So this is obviously a different building, but in 1948 and 49, it was a warehouse where Robert Duncan and Jack Spicer were living, and a frequent house guest was Philip La Mancha, who was a portal into the weird stuff that Dick later got interested in. This is 1126 Francisco Street. This is a big life. This might be the house he lived in the longest of anything in his entire life.
Probably true.
Yeah, 50 to 58 with Cleo. This was a house that he bought with a down payment he saved up over a couple of years working in the record store. It had a dirt floor for part of it. It was definitely
The house itself had
the house had partly dirt floor. It was really, this was a small rundown part of Berkeley. Hi.
Hey.
We're dickheads. We're just having a little tour.
How did you get you right on?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
sweet.
I met you before. No worries.
No worries.
We'll leave soon.
He wrote that he stayed here for so long only because the mortgage was only $35 a month.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's only like 36 now, right?
That's right. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been here for 17 years, so it's only $36 a month.
Yeah, there you go. Good for you.
Thanks, man.
But the important thing to keep in
walls.
mind here is that this is where Philip K. Dick's writing career really began.
Yeah.
And this is the porch where they got 17 rejection letters in one day. This is where he was living when he sold his first story, his first novel, when he went and met Van Vogt, and all these guys told him, you know, you got to write novels. It's the major period in his life where things really took off for him, and it's, I think, almost entirely unchanged. You know, the house, the shape of the house, the frame of the house. was
The
unchanged.
window was replaced. That's a bigger window than.
Oh,
it was
was it?
initially.
Okay.
So
Okay.
what would he have been working on right now in this period in his life?
So literally everything. So all of the main, probably at least some of Gather Yourselves Together. Then all of the short stories that he sold, Rug, Beyond Lies the Wub, early material.
That first 3 years, there's like 67
Exactly.
stories.
That's right.
something
That's right.
like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So pumping them out, and then The Man Who Japed.
World Jones.
No, that's later. The World Jones made Time Out, and then Eye in the Sky, and part of Time Out a Joint. So I think, you know, the experience of reaching for the light switch, but it's actually a light pull. I think that happened in this house. But Time Out a Joint marks the transition period, because there's a side character that's named after Anne in Time Out a Joint. So it's clear that he was working on the edits there. But yeah, this is where, you know, the guy was a mainstream writer, became a science fiction writer who still wished to be successful in the mainstream. And I think a person who had a lot of marital bliss. You know, some of the few times he was really, I think, happy in a marriage was here. His mother, Dorothy, would come by and bring early Scientologists over to speak in tongues on the couch to regress and recount their past lives. And Cleo is very skeptical. And what's interesting to me is that it matches some of this other stuff. You know, Dick's mother was interested in these past lives and in people suddenly speaking Greek, and yet now, and later in his life, he was the one who was convinced that he was speaking Greek. So again, my theory is that as a teenager, Dick really rebelled against his mother's ideological belief system, and later came to really embrace it fervently, passionately, to the point where he was a proselytizer of it, trying to get other people to get into it. So yeah, this is a really cool location on the tour. One thing we didn't mention is that right around in this neighborhood, Anthony Boucher had a house where he was giving weekly writing classes. And both Phil and his mother would attend those. And it was, of course, Boucher that bought Rug from Phil for great money and published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So, I mean, it's a very important house in terms of Dick's career, and I think Dick's career is pretty important in terms of science fiction. So, that's how it maps out. Well, one thing we didn't mention is that right around in this neighborhood, Anthony Boucher had a house where he was giving weekly writing classes. And both Phil and his mother would attend those. And it was, of course, Boucher that bought Rug from Phil for great money and published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. This is the corner of San Pablo and University in Berkeley, where the first nuclear bomb falls in a World War III situation in the novel Dr. Blood Money. This avenue here, San Pablo, stretching north, I think also figures prominently in Dick's work as a kind of symbolism of blue-collar, working-class concerns that were, alongside the academic concerns of the college community. And so, in a lot of ways, his sort of middle-class, working-class writer existence is, for him, I think, symbolized by this stretch of road. And This would have been a nuclear target because the university was doing all kinds of research on nuclear weapons, including the Livermore nuclear bomb stuff. Yeah.
Was that sort of in the air at the time?
Yeah, absolutely in the air.
Oppenheimer was at.
This is 560 Calusa Avenue. This is the house that Phil and Dorothy moved into after being in D.C., Washington, D.C. for a few years. And as you can see, it's small. The next house we're going to go to is a little bit bigger. My take of the sort of interesting thing to pay attention to here is that Phil and Dorothy came back much more financially stable and well off than when they left. And my read of that is that Dorothy knew that there was going to be grant money coming to Washington, D.C. because of the New Deal, which was Roosevelt's anti-depression poverty legislation. And she positioned herself to be in a government office for, it was the Children's Bureau of the Department of Labor, I believe. And she managed to move from essentially a secretary to an author of pamphlets about childcare towards the end. All right, now this place is fascinating. So this is 1212 Walnut. This is the house after Calusa. And my belief is this is the house they purchased in the summer of 1940. Mima and Marion living here as well. And the really cool thing is that it's way down this path. It's a house way set off the front lawn. Here it was not just Phil and his mother, but also his grandmother, his mother's mother, Mima, and his aunt, Dorothy's sister, Marion, who suffered from mental illness, catatonic schizophrenia, and was also a kindred spirit for Phil, no pun intended or slightly intended, in the sense that they were both artists and big feelers and had a kind of a camaraderie. Just naturally, they kindred spirits is the way to describe it. This is 1414 Arch Street, where Phil lived in 1944 at the very least. And the reason that we know that he lived here is that he wrote a letter to Amazing Stories in March of 1944. And I'm going to read it.
Okay.
Sirs, upon removing the envelope from this letter, you will find a neatly wrapped and prepared brick bat. The first one off the assembly line. Frankly, I've been reading Amazing Stories and Fantastic Adventures since the year 1, and this is the first edition that I have come across which doesn't come up to par. First of all, one realizes that poor material published is not the fault of the editor. We all realize that most of your best men have gone to war. But my chief gripe is that one of the usually fine authors has gone on the rocks. Intruder from the Stars by Ross Rockline is not so good. Rather crudely written, unconvincing, and reads as if it was shortened from a much longer draft. Next on the list, Master of the Living Dead by Ed Earl Repo. This would have been all right, but somehow the story leaves a bad taste in the mouth. There's nothing a little disgusting about the plot. The Mad Robot by William P. McGivern is about the best in the January issue. The author is always good. The story was pleasant and interesting, but one thing, it was kind of obvious that Ho Agar would turn out to be responsible for the trouble. Island of Eternal Storm by Berkeley Livingston. Nice plot, no crude description, well written. The kind of life and death reversed, something to think about. Phantom City of Luna by Costello. I think everyone likes time travel stories. The Needle Points to Death by Gerald Vance. The plot was so-so, but amazingly well written and showed great promise. In spite of the knocks dealt out, the magazine is still a buy for a quarter. The covers are years ahead of any other publications. Fine drawings and colors. What about getting some Hans Bach's art? He's good. Philip K. Dick, 1411 Arch Street, Berkeley, California. The editor responds, you are actually the only reader who did not rave about Rockline's yarn. More of Williams is coming up. New artists, if good, are always welcome. This issue of Amazing Stories had something like 25 pages of letters from the readers.
Whoa.
So it was a real place where a kind of early kind of message board culture where people weren't just receiving information, but they were talking about their their impressions. Now, this was written in 1944, so Phil would have been 16. That is a pretty profoundly critical assessment of an issue of literature from a 16-year-old. And it just
He's
shows.
taking it very seriously.
And he knew the genre very well.
Yeah.
And so you get a real sense for what his involvement was as a writer. You know, he was thinking about things as a writer, not as a philosopher. That comes later. He really thought of himself as a writer, and how could he engage these ideas. This shifted my mind about Philip K. Dick. I really imagined him as a working class, lower class writer, and that's an oversimplification, although it's one that he played up quite a bit. It's really important to understand him as a middle class writer who had basically a middle class aesthetic, who had well-educated parents, who was interested in art and literature, and I don't think quite often got his hands dirty or callous doing a bunch of hard work. But this is just a beautiful house. So yeah, I mean, the same, just a block away, but not exactly in the same socioeconomic bracket. And of course, this was like the house where Oppenheimer was coming as a dinner guest and all that kind of stuff. So
they were hot shots.
They
in
were
the
hot shit,
intellectual
yeah.
scene.
Absolutely.
They had tons of people here all the time.
Yeah.
What did her parents do at the time?
So her father was Kroeber, who started the anthropology department at Cal. And he had a whole hall named after him. He was a really, really famous anthropologist, and some of his practices haven't aged well. And so he's not talked about in the same glowing terms he used to be. But he's a titan in the field, and of course influenced all of Le Guin's writing along those anthropological lines so well.
And her and Dick were living on the same street, but not at the same time? Or
At the same time,
But didn't know each
1944, but didn't know each other.
other. In school. At the same
So they were
school.
probably just walking up
Never
and down.
actually met in person. Right?
Never actually met in person. That's right.
Wow.
Just
Yeah.
corresponded.
Just corresponded, exactly. There was talk that they would go to France together when Phil was returning, but he never got to go. He died before it happened.